The purpose of this policy dialogue is to bring all the stakeholders, key stakeholders around the table and discuss, find synergies for the collective actions. A sustained, coherent and inclusive approach that promotes a coordinated response at all levels, either it's community level, district level, provincial level or national level, that can help us to build a resilient education system in Pakistan for the access of quality education to all, either in the times of crisis and peace.
The impetus for this research was rooted in this puzzle that we've had a number of experiences with very large-scale shocks. 2005 earthquake, flooding is actually quite serious, quite frequent. The scale of devastation hasn't been as much as it was in 2010, 2012, and now 2022, but it's been very frequent. And the COVID-19 pandemic. And the people around this table, there's a fair amount of you who have put in both technical and financial resources in responding to these shocks. But the level of devastation we've seen in 2022 would suggest that some of the experiences of devastation aren't decreasing necessarily as we would hope for any response. There's this large, widespread perception that people are ignorant, and that's why their children are out of school. They don't want to send their children to school. We know based on surveys we've collected, but also I think one of them was done by Barron at the World Bank in the aftermath of the floods, household surveys I've done, where children are not going to school because they can't see the value proposition the schools are offering. It's not that they are ignorant. It's not that there's a cultural problem, as I think the mainstream sort of discourse really says. It's because they are not learning anything. And you can see that there. It's because it's not linked to market outcomes for them. There needs to be a value that says you go to school, you put in this time, and what you're getting out of it is going to be worth the income you're giving up as a child laborer, for example, or any other reasons.
The education recovery cannot be made unless social, emotional recovery of the human being is made first. And that includes the family of the child as well. So this cannot be, seen in terms of isolated activity. Something education sector is something else and the other sector is something else, because these sectors only exist in our minds. These sectors do not exist separately within a family, living. So someone has to come with earnings and someone has to come with, rebuilding or jobs, and as part of something, education also becomes. So we need to actually restore their dreams in the sense that you had a dream and now this has been affected. Now how do you actually can recreate that dream?
I'd like to just cite a forthcoming World Bank report. It's the Human Capital Review that, colleagues actually spent years on, and that showed that at this point in time, a child born in Pakistan is only 41%, is only likely to achieve 41% of the human capital potential. And for Sindh and Balochistan, the two provinces that have been hardest affected by the floods, it's the 0.36 is the human capital index for Sindh, and 0.32 is the human capital index for Balochistan. 40% of children under 5 are stunted. You had COVID, 75% learning poverty, the figure that we quote, the estimates are that it's gone up to 79%. So we're looking at a crisis within a crisis, and then you have the economic crisis in Pakistan. So really, need to think of what we as development partners can do to kind of keep the impetus on making sure that, yes, there is a focus on recovery, but at the same time, the long-term priorities of the government remain on making sure that as many boys and girls come back to school.
And I think one of the key things that really stuck out for me is this question of timeframes. The fact that There's been a humanitarian disaster which requires an immediate response, whether that's temporary learning centres, whether that's immediate provisions of food and shelter. But in fact, when it comes to education, the real damage is actually many, many years down the line, when learning losses is year after year after year accumulate.
The first point that we need to really make sure that we do work on the transition, because these temporary learning centers, they would not have any meaning until we really ensure that how the transition is going to look like.
And in 2011, I was involved in a report on the response of the 2010 floods. And we found that there are, a lot of policy issues which need to be addressed. And one of the policy issues was, duplication of the roles of, various agencies involved in the response. And one of the issues that came up was exactly the role of ERA, which is, duplicating a lot of, function. And I think at a policy level that needs to be looked at very seriously.
We need to look at where we can get additional financing resources. Wasim Saab would be more aware of, I think, the international financing facility for education, where it has come out as of now, what options are there. But I think, financing can be made more comfortable for developing countries like Pakistan through accessing these facilities and other partners.
What is coming up for me is that we also need to be wary about using what worked during COVID-19 as a flood response, because the circumstances are very different. Parents have less time, so home-based responses require a lot more thinking. We don't want to overburden communities either. And also the infrastructural damages that we're all very familiar with, so I won't spend time on that. But what we're finding on some research that we're conducting at EdTech Hub, because we've kind of followed communities through the relief period onto now where they're going, some are returning back to school. And we're finding that we've gone from, provision of TLC's infrastructure to a kind of blank spot where teachers don't know what they're doing when they come back to school.
Be better to have that kind of the minimum standard for the learning environment, and then the learning, teaching, learning, the level. So set up that the minimum learning standard and then monitor based on that the minimum standard, whether that is fulfilling, at least that deliver the quality education. So that is one thing, and then definitely contents-wise, we have to assure that's possible.
Even before the crisis, right, we had a learning environment crisis to begin with. In Sindh alone, we had 7,000 out of 40,000 shelterless schools. That's a very stark number. All in all, you only had 19% of schools which didn't have some kind of an infrastructure crisis or a need for repair. So those are numbers that we need to take into account. But how do we go about doing that? We need to take a closer look at the data. We need to take a closer look at the access issues. And at the bank, that's precisely what we are doing. We are using satellite imagery data to assess what happened in these floods, what did access look like per catchment areas, what happened during the 2010 floods, because you're looking at recurrent disasters. Does it make sense to rebuild schools in the same areas? So I think all of this is embedded in data.
Then budget. Regarding budget, we have almost more than 85% of the budget used to go for teacher salary. We don't have any specific development plans, and as in the education sector plans and other things, these are almost on papers, and when they come in such type of forms, they share that we are doing this and that music teachers would be appointed. We are working for transgenders and other things, but on ground, what have they done regarding quality education?
But I think from the public sector, these are questions that we have to contend with. How do we build accountability? How do we empower local governments? How do we ensure that education is embedded into larger holistic questions of accountability to citizens? So I think that will feed and will hopefully help implementation if we have ownership and participation from ground up rather than top down.
Acts do not necessarily open up or pave the way forward for any department to do anything unless there are rules. So our acts are incomplete. In the absence of rules, the department will not do anything, and we will not be able to hold government or the education department officials accountable ever. So not having rules serves government's interest of not doing anything. So there are eyewashes after eyewashes, but real action won't happen unless the rules are there.
We are supporting a response to the floods, both in KP Punjab, the two provinces where we worked traditionally, but also in Sindh, in fact, so that's sort of pivoting existing programs was something that was completely unplanned for. Having said that, that's just a small drop in the ocean, and ultimately it's the government-led efforts, but also the communities.
The role of education in emergency isn't really understood as much often, because there's a huge emphasis on thinking pehle roti ho, kapde ho, ye wo ho, and that's correct. But at the same time, the fact that education is seen as something that's focused on just learning misses the point. TLCs, education spaces, are excellent venues for multidimensional ventures, whether that's delivering health, school feeding, so on and so forth. So the idea that somehow education is something that needs to happen later, I think really misses the point and is a weakness in government strategy. In particular, when I think about, okay, so what should education in emergency be?
I think the paper is radical because of three shifts which Mueza is pushing. The first shift is she's pushing for brick and mortar response to more of a learning focused response. That strategic shift that we need for pragmatic reasons also, because you need $1.5 billion to construct these schools. The second shift she wanted to make was the public sector to more of a public-private partnership sector, and then we met with Murad Ali Shah sir. The third shift she made is from top down to bottom up by asking for empowering of the head teachers. From Malala Fund, I'm thankful to all of you from my team, Wasim sir, especially you, Zahra, of course, our champion. Our other champions were here, Kulsum from Muzaffargarh. She didn't speak, but she represents communities doing great work in Muzaffargarh, and other colleagues who are there. Thank you very much.